The road to Eldermere was a ribbon of mud and stone, winding through fields still scarred by war. Sir Alaric of Blackmore rode slowly, his horse's hooves dragging as if they, too, were weary. 5 years of battle had left him hollow, not just in body, but in spirit. His once broad shoulders were hunched under the weight of his armor, and his left arm hung useless at his side, the wound from a poisoned arrow still festering despite the healer's efforts. The castle loomed ahead, its gray stones softened by the evening mist. Alaric had always thought it looked like a clenched fist, unyielding and cold. He wondered if it would feel like home again. King Torin met him in the courtyard, his face a mask of relief and frustration. "You look like death," Torin said, clasping Alaric's good shoulder. "Yeah." Alaric's voice rough from disuse. Torin's gaze flicked to the bandages peeking out from Alaric's sleeve. "Infirmary," he said, not unkindly. "Kalia will see to you." Alaric nodded, too tired to argue. He'd known Kalia since they were children, though they'd never been close. She was Torin's sister, sharp-tongued and sharp-minded, a woman who'd buried a husband and child, and still managed to run the kingdom's hospitals with ruthless efficiency. The infirmary was a drafty hall at the back of the castle, its windows shuttered against the chill. The air smelled of herbs and damp wool, and the sound of low voices and clinking bottles filled the space. Kalia stood at a table near the hearth, grinding something in a mortar. She didn't look up as Alaric entered. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a stool with her elbow, as he lowered himself onto the wooden seat. Kalia finally turned, her eyes scanning him with clinical detachment. She was taller than he remembered, her dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. Her hands, though, were the same, steady and sure as she unwound his bandages. "Poetry won't heal sepsis, Sir Knight," she said, her tone dry as dust. "Hold still." Alaric blinked. "Poetry?" She gestured to the small book poking out of his saddlebag. "You've been writing. I can see the ink stains on your fingers." He looked down at his hands, surprised she'd noticed. "It passes the time," he said. Kalia hummed, unimpressed. She cleaned his wound with a solution that burned like fire, her movements brisk and efficient. Alaric bit back a curse, his jaw tightening. "You're lucky," she said, wrapping fresh bandages around his arm. "Another week, and you'd have lost the arm, or your life." Kalia paused, studying him for a moment. Then she stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Will you play chess?" she asked, nodding to a board set up on a nearby table. Alaric replied, "I can barely lift a spoon." "Good," she said. "Then you'll lose quickly and I can get back to work." He almost smiled at that. Almost. They sat across from each other, the chessboard between them. Kelia moved first, her fingers brushing the pieces with practiced ease. Alaric followed, his movements slow and deliberate. She beat him in 6 moves. War isn't won by brute force, it's won by outthinking your enemy, she said, resetting the board. Alaric stared at the pieces, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You've been practicing. I've been winning, she corrected. There's a difference. He laughed then, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle them both. Kalia's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile, before she turned back to her work. Rest, she said, not looking at him. You'll need your strength if you're going to lose to me again tomorrow. Alaric nodded, though he doubted he'd sleep. The infirmary was too quiet, the weight of the past 5 years pressing down on him like a stone. But as he lay on the narrow cot, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of Kalia's movements, he felt something he hadn't in years, a flicker of hope. The days blurred together in the infirmary. Alaric's strength returned slowly, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. Kalia's care was relentless. Herbal poultices, bitter tonics, and a strict regimen of rest that left him restless. She was a force of nature, moving through the infirmary with a quiet intensity that brooked no argument. One morning, as Alaric sat by the window, trying to read a medical text Kalia had thrust into his hands, Torin stormed into the infirmary. His face was flushed, his jaw tight with frustration. Kalia, he said, his voice sharp. We need to talk. She didn't look up from the mortar where she was grinding herbs. If it's about the grain trade, I've already told you, selling our ships is a mistake. It's not about the ships, Torin snapped. It's about you. That got her attention. She set the pestle down and turned to face him, her arms crossed. What about me? Torin hesitated, his gaze flicking to Alaric. Leave us, he said, but Kalia held up a hand. He stays. He's my patient, and I'm not done with him. Torin scowled but didn't argue. Lord Edric has offered a trade alliance, he said, but he wants a marriage to seal it. Kalia's expression didn't change, but Alaric saw the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. And you've decided to sell your sister to the highest bidder, she said, her voice icy. It's not like that, Torin said, though his tone lacked conviction. This alliance could save us from famine. You know how bad the harvests have been. Sell your ships, not your sister, Kalia shot back. Or better yet, find another way. You're the king, Torin. Start acting like it. Torin's face darkened. You think I want this? You think I enjoy bartering my own blood? I think you're taking the easy way out. Kalia said, "and I won't be part of it." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Alaric shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder in a family argument. Finally, Torin turned on his heel and left, the door slamming behind him. Kalia let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping. For a moment, she looked tired, truly tired, not just the weariness of long hours, but the kind that seeped into the bones. Alaric cleared his throat. "You could refuse," he said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "And let the peasants starve? You know the cost of principle better than anyone." He did. His own family had died in a famine when he was a boy, their village wiped out by hunger and disease. He joined the king's army to escape the memory, but it had followed him like a shadow. "There has to be another way," he said. Kalia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "There is, but it won't be easy." She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a stack of parchment, spreading it across the table. It was a map of the kingdom, marked with notes and calculations. "The granaries are outdated," she said. "If we modernize them, we can store enough grain to last through the lean years. But Torin won't listen to me. He thinks I'm just a widow playing at politics." Alaric leaned over the map, his eyes tracing the lines. "What do you need?" "Your help," she said. "You're a war hero, Torin's most trusted advisor. If you present the plan, he might listen." Alaric hesitated. "I'm not much of a strategist when it comes to grain." "Then I'll teach you. And in return, I'll help you recover, properly. No more half measures," Kalia said. He raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were already doing that." "I was. But now I'll actually try," she said. They spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the map, Kalia explaining the intricacies of grain storage and crop rotation. Alaric listened intently, asking questions and making notes in the margins. It was the first time in years he'd felt useful, not as a soldier, but as a man. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Kalia leaned back in her chair. "You're not as hopeless as you look," she said, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow we start convincing Torin." The weight of the task ahead was daunting, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose. As he lay on the narrow cot, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of Kalia's movements, he realized something. He wasn't just fighting for the kingdom anymore. He was fighting for her. Alaric presented the proposal with Kalia's notes, his voice steady, despite the lingering pain in his arm. The council listened, but their faces were skeptical. "Grain storage?" one lord scoffed. "We need soldiers, not farmers." The plan to modernize the granaries was met with resistance, not just from Torin, but from the council. Soldiers can't fight on empty stomachs, Alaric replied, his tone sharper than he intended. Torin leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We'll discuss it, he said, ending the meeting. Alaric left the council chamber feeling frustrated but not defeated. He found Kalia in the infirmary, grinding herbs with her usual intensity. Well, she asked, not looking up. They said they'll discuss it. Oh, which means they'll do nothing. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly. Kalia taught Alaric everything she knew about agriculture and logistics, her patience endless despite his occasional frustration. In return, he shared stories of his campaigns, his voice softening when he spoke of the villages he'd seen destroyed by famine. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the infirmary, Kalia handed him a small, leather-bound book. What's this? A journal, she said. Write down your ideas. It'll help you organize your thoughts. Alaric hesitated. I'm not much of a writer. You write poetry, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. This is no different. He took the journal, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Kalia stood, her cheeks faintly pink. Get some rest, she said. We'll start again tomorrow. That night, Alaric opened the journal and began to write. At first, his words were clumsy, but as the days passed, they flowed more easily. He wrote about the granaries, about the villages he'd seen, and about Kalia, her sharp tongue, her steady hands, the way her eyes softened when she thought no one was looking. One morning, Torin summoned Alaric to the borderlands to negotiate with a group of rebellious lords. The journey would take weeks, and Alaric's heart sank at the thought of leaving Kalia behind. You'll be fine, she said, packing a satchel of herbs and bandages. Just don't drink their ale. It's brewed with seawater. He almost smiled. I'll miss your cheerful bedside manner. She handed him the satchel, her fingers lingering on his for a moment. Write to me, she said. And so the letters began. Dear Kalia, the borderlands are as bleak as I remember. The rebels are stubborn, but they're not unreasonable. I think we can reach an agreement, though it may take time. The sea here is a sorrowful blue. It reminds me of your eyes. Yours, Alaric. Sorrowful blue? You've been reading too much poetry. Focus on the negotiations, and don't let them poison you. I've enclosed a tonic. Drink it before meals. Yours, Kalia. Alaric writes another letter. Your tonic tastes like despair, but it works. The rebels have agreed to a truce, though they're wary of Torin's intentions. I've been thinking about the granaries. What if we used the old quarry for storage? The stone would keep the grain cool. Yeah, she replied. The quarry is a good idea, though it'll take work to make it usable. I've started drafting plans. Don't let the rebels flatter you. They'll turn on you the moment it suits them. The letters became a lifeline, a thread connecting them across the miles. Alaric wrote of the sea, the stars, and the ache in his arm that never quite faded. Kalia sent pressed herbs, dry advice, and the occasional sharp remark that made him laugh despite the distance. One night, as Alaric sat by the fire in a drafty inn, he opened a letter to find a sparrow's feather tucked inside. Dear Alaric, the sparrow flies south at winter's first frost. Remember that, if you need me. Yours, Kalia. He held the feather carefully, his heart aching with something he couldn't name. The letters continued, but as the weeks turned into months, the distance between them grew heavier. Alaric's negotiations with the border lords dragged on, the rebels' demands shifting like the tides. Kalia, meanwhile, faced her own battles in Eldermere. Torin's growing impatience, the council's skepticism, and the ever-present weight of her responsibilities. One evening, as Kalia sat in the infirmary sorting through Alaric's latest letter, Torin stormed in. His face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists. What is this? He demanded, throwing a crumpled piece of parchment onto the table. Kalia's heart sank as she recognized Alaric's handwriting. Where did you get this? Does it matter? Torin snapped. You've been writing to him, behind my back. Kalia stood, her voice steady, despite the fear curling in her chest. He's my friend, and he's helping us. Helping us. Torin laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He's a distraction, and you're a fool if you think this won't end badly. Kalia's hands trembled, but she kept her voice calm. I'm not a fool, Torin, and I'm not a pawn in your political games. Torin's expression darkened. You're my sister, and you will do as I say. He turned on his heel and left, the door slamming behind him. Kalia sank into her chair, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She picked up Alaric's letter, her fingers tracing the words he'd written. The sparrow flies south at winter's first frost. She knew what she had to do. Alaric returned to Eldermere under the cover of darkness, his heart heavy with dread. Torin's summons had been brief and cold. Return at once. Your presence is required. He found Kalia waiting for him in the infirmary, her face pale but determined. What's happened? He asked, his voice low. Oh, Torin knows, she said. About the letters. Alaric's stomach twisted. What did he say? He's sending you to the northern border, she said, to guard against raiders. It's a death sentence, Alaric. You're not strong enough. He shook his head. I'll go. I have to. Kelia stepped closer, her eyes blazing. No, you'll stay. Let Torin think you're dead. We'll leave tonight, find a village, start over. Alaric hesitated, his heart torn. And abandon the men I've sworn to protect? Kalia's hands clenched into fists. You can't save everyone. But I can try, he said softly. She gently kissed on his lips, fierce and fleeting before stepping back. Alaric's heart ached, but he nodded. I'll come back, I promise. The northern border was a desolate place, the wind howling across frozen fields. Alaric's men were weary, their spirits low. But Alaric pushed them forward, his determination unwavering. One night, as they camped in the shadow of a crumbling watchtower, Alaric opened a letter from Kalia. It was short, just a few lines. The sparrow waits. Be careful. Yours, Kalia. He tucked the letter into his coat, close to his heart, and stared at the stars. Somewhere, far away, Kalia was waiting, and he would find his way back to her. The northern border was a place of endless cold and silence. Alaric's men huddled around campfires, their breath visible in the frosty air. The raiders were relentless, their attacks swift and brutal. Alaric's body ached from the constant strain, but it was his mind that bore the heaviest burden. Every night, he opened Kalia's letters, her words a lifeline in the darkness. She wrote of the granaries, the hospital, and the quiet hope that one day the kingdom would heal. Her letters were practical, but there was an undercurrent of longing that mirrored his own. One evening, as Alaric sat by the fire, a messenger arrived from Eldermere. The man's face was pale, his hands trembling as he handed Alaric a sealed letter. From the king, the messenger said, "Return at once. Torin is dying." Alaric rode through the night, his horse's hooves pounding against the frozen ground. The journey felt endless, his mind racing with fear and guilt. When he finally reached Eldermere, the castle was shrouded in silence. Kalia met him at the gates, her face drawn and tired. "He's in the infirmary," she said. Alaric followed her through the dimly lit halls, his heart pounding. Torin lay on a narrow cot, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Alaric," Torin said, his voice weak but steady. "You came." Alaric knelt beside the bed, his throat tight. "I'm here, my lord." Torin's hand trembled as he reached for Alaric's. "I was wrong," he said, "about you, about Kalia. I thought I was protecting her, but I was only holding her back." Alaric shook his head. "You were doing what you thought was best." Torin's grip tightened. "Promise me something," he said. "Take care of her and the kingdom." Alaric hesitated, but Kalia's hand on his shoulder steadied him. "I promise," he said. Torrens smiled faintly, his eyes closing. Torren died that night, his last breath a quiet sigh. The kingdom mourned, but there was no time for grief. The council gathered in the great hall, their faces grim. "We need a leader," one lord said, "someone to guide us through this." Galeric stood at the front of the room, Kalia by his side. He felt the weight of their expectations, the burden of Torren's last request. "I'll stay," he said, "as your advisor. Let the sparrow and the sword outthink them together." The council murmured their approval, but Alaric's eyes were on Kalia. She nodded, her expression resolute. The days that followed were a blur of meetings and decisions. Alaric and Kalia worked tirelessly, their bond stronger than ever. The years passed, and Eldermere began to heal. The granaries stood full, the hospital expanded, and the people of the kingdom found a fragile peace. Alaric and Kalia worked side by side, their bond deepening with each passing day. They married in the same chapel where they had once argued, the ceremony simple and quiet. Kalia wore her late husband's cloak, the fabric softened by time, and Alaric tucked a sparrow's feather into his lapel. There were no grand celebrations, no feasts or tournaments, just the two of them, their hands clasped tightly, and the whispered vows that bound them together. Their life was not one of grand adventures or sweeping romances. It was built on small, quiet moments. They expanded the hospital, turning it into a place of healing and learning. Kalia trained healers, her sharp tongue softened by years of teaching. Alaric worked with the farmers, his knowledge of strategy applied to crop rotation and irrigation. Years turned into decades, and the weight of time began to show. Alaric's hair turned gray, his movements slower, but no less determined. Kalia's hands, once steady and sure, now trembled as she ground herbs. One winter, Alaric fell ill. The fever came on suddenly, his body racked with chills. Kalia tended to him day and night, her face pale with worry. "You're not allowed to leave me," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere." But the fever worsened, and Alaric knew his time was short. He lay in the infirmary, the fire crackling in the hearth, and reached for Kalia's hand. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything, my dear." Kalia was nearly hiding her tears behind. "Keep writing," he said. "Keep healing, and don't forget me." Kalia's eyes filled with tears. "I could never forget you." Alaric smiled, his eyes closing. He died that night, his hand in Kalia's. the kingdom mourned, but Kalia's grief was a quiet, private thing. She buried him under a hawthorn tree, the sparrow's feather from their wedding tucked into his coat. One spring morning, as the first frost melted from the fields, Kalia sat by the window in the infirmary. She opened the journal to a page Alaric had written years ago. The sparrow flies south at winter's first frost. Remember that. Thank you for spending this time with me. The story may be over, but the gentle music will keep you company a little longer. Let it wash away the worries of the day. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. Good night.